Hello, my name is Milton Thompson, and welcome to my YouTube channel. And the particular series that I'm doing right now is on leadership, and particularly the behaviors of effective leaders. And in the first two, I talked about various characteristics. I talked about the ability of leaders to lift up other people, to maximize their talents. I talked about certain characteristics of leaders, and I've tried to be positive in talking about the positive characteristics. I've also shared that I have been blessed throughout my life and career to have a run of exceptionally good leaders. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit, though, about leaders that are not good role models and some of the characteristics of them. I really want to draw my source material today from the Bible. And I want to talk about three different leaders who followed each other in succession. And those leaders are King Saul, David, and Absalom. So let me start with King Saul. King Saul was an extremely handsome man. The prophet Samuel describes him in such a way that he was handsome. He was very tall. He was about a head taller than everybody else. And when he started out, he seemed to have humility. Later, when Samuel rebukes him for when Saul does something horrendous as king and doesn't obey God, he tells him that when he first started out, he was small in his own eyes. Now, that's a very important phrase. And Saul is shy to begin with. And so, supernaturally, God introduces Saul to Samuel. Samuel anoints Saul as king, and Saul begins well. And he begins by obeying God. Saul understands, and most good leaders understand, that we're always accountable to an ultimate authority. And the ultimate authority is God. And so, but then Saul's character flaws begin to surface over time. One of them is that he has fear of people. He was assigned on one occasion to go and to wipe out the Amalekites. They were enemies to Israel, and that was his assignment, and not to bring back anything alive, and not to take any plunder from them. But after killing off all the people, Saul decides to spare the life of the king of the Amalekites, Agag, and being pressed upon by his soldiers want to take some of the plunder. So, in direct disobedience to God, Saul caves in to the pressure from the people. And when Samuel catches up with Saul and he says, "Look, why haven't you obeyed the Lord?" Saul said, "Well, the people put pressure on me, and the people wanted this, so I went with what the people wanted." Now, that's a weakness in a leader, because there are times, and even though in the previous videos I've talked about reading the room, and I've talked about the fact that leaders are not leaders unless people will follow them, there are occasions where you have to make unpopular decisions, and you have to make decisions based on right and wrong, even when people don't agree with you. And so Saul's insecurities started to play through. By the way, on the occasion where Saul disobeyed God, and that I had just mentioned, when Samuel is looking all over the place to try to find where Saul is, uh, he talks to a group of people, and he asks, "Where's Saul?" And they tell him, "Well, Saul's not here. He's gone up to such and such, and he's erected a monument for himself, or a monument of himself." Now, what's interesting about that is God told him to do something, and he disobeyed God, which meant his assignment was a failure. But Saul, because he was so driven by insecurity and so driven to be somebody in front of his men, he thought it was a success, and He erected a monument to himself saying, man, I'm at the top of the heap. I've done everything that I should have done, when exactly the opposite was true. And when Samuel confronts him on that, Saul says, I fully obeyed the Lord. And then Samuel says, how come I'm hearing cattle in the background? In other words, Samuel knew that plunder had been taken in disobedience to God. Now, use Saul as an example of extremely insecure leadership. You would think that insecurity would trigger certain behaviors, but I'll tell you, human beings react to insecurity in two different ways. Some, it causes them to lapse into a sense of complete inferiority to where they can't do anything because they're completely insecure. They're stalemated by their lack of talent. They're stalemated by their insecurity. But then insecurity can be the flip side to pride. In other words, there are insecure people who then do dastardly things. You know, it would be hard to believe, but some of the worst dictators and worst murderers in history had insecurities. People like Hitler, people like Stalin. And they covered their inferiority and their insecurities by going to the other extreme. See, they didn't want people to know that they were weak. So in order to prove that they were strong, some of them did dastardly, incredibly hurtful, destructive things to cover up their own insecurities. By the way, if you're a leader, all leaders, being human beings, have insecurities. And one of your assignments as a leader is to find out what those insecurities are and then not to let them be the motivation for what you do. A person with insecurity will be performance oriented because they're compensating for their insecurities. So Saul reached a point where God wouldn't speak to him anymore because he was completely disobedient over and over and over again. And eventually God removed him as king. Okay, so that's Saul. And I use Saul as an example of insecurity, and I use Saul as an example of a leader who will cave and do what's wrong under pressure from other people. Saul was succeeded by David, but it's interesting. While Saul was still king, God anointed David. However, God didn't allow David to become king for a number of years, and God placed him under the leadership of Saul. On occasion, as God is developing you, in whether it's in business, in education, or in the church, in ministry, God may put you under a Saul. Saul became so jealous of David that there were multiple occasions where Saul tried to pin David to the wall with his spear. Saul was completely jealous of David. As a matter of fact, when David slew Goliath, the women in Israel came up with this cute song that said Saul was slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And that stuck in Saul's craw. And he got madder and madder and madder at David. Because again, Saul is an insecure leader. Insecure leaders cannot have people around them or under them or reporting to them who are more talented in areas. That's a mark of insecurity. You know, a secure leader surrounds themselves with people who have expertise and have talents that they don't have. A great historical example of that, Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, had a cabinet of people, some of whom even despised him and minimized him uh, because he wasn't surrounding himself with yes men. He surrounded himself with people who were very, very capable, with people who had strengths in areas where he did not. But ultimately, history exonerates his choices because he was a phenomenal leader. And he could deal with having people who had greater talents and greater insight and other things than he did. Back to David. David then, at a young age, was placed under the mentorship of Saul, who hated him. And David would go about and do the king's business, was fully obedient to King Saul. When Saul, when Saul reached a point where he was out to kill David, David fled from Saul. But when given occasion to kill Saul, David refused to do that. He always saw Saul as the leader of Israel, and even when his men encouraged him to kill Saul, David wouldn't take advantage. There was one occasion where Saul was asleep outside of a cave where David was hiding, and David's men, and God, it says in the narrative, that God had put Saul and his whole army into a deep sleep. So David and his men walked right up to Saul, and one of his men said, "Look, if you won't kill him, I'll kill him. Look, God has put him in right into your hands." But David refused. David refused to take on uh, a position of leadership before God wanted him to take that position of leadership. You know, there are many leaders that are so ambitious and so self promoting that what happens is they take on a mantle that they're not prepared for. In other words, the leadership that God has in mind for them is much greater, but they, by manipulation and by other things, try to take it on, and it's like a child wearing a man's suit. And all of us have experienced that. In the world, they called that, there was a book that was written, and the title was The Peter Principle. And the Peter Principle basically said that a person can get into positions that exceed their level of talent and expertise and wisdom. And many times, what people who are overly ambitious will do is they'll take that one step beyond where their talent is, where their wisdom is, where their abilities are, and then, of course, they'll experience failure. I've done that. I've done that where I took that one step beyond because of ambition and thought that I had more talent than I really did. I took a job as superintendent over the North Chicago School District. And I took the job because I thought, because I had been a change agent, my ego was so full that I thought, well, I can take on any challenge because, I have all this wisdom and all these skills, and I know how to work with people. And so, I did that. Now, to be honest with you, one day I was praying, and as I was praying, I just felt the Lord on the inside say, if you take this job, it's going to be a hornet's nest. But the pay was exceptionally well. I was going to be given, the ability to make a lot of high level decisions, and I'm a change agent, and it was a district that was a mess. They had 19 superintendents over a 21-year period, which should have been, to a person who's not ego driven, should have been like the red flag. But it wasn't to me. I was stupid. I thought that I was God's gift to any situation. And so what happened was I took the job. And when I took the job, the stress was so great, it started to break my health. Now, I even took friends who were highly capable, highly skilled to be the highest level of administration along with me. And even that didn't help. So my ego drove me beyond my capabilities and my ability into a situation that I could not succeed in. And I didn't succeed at that. And it always bothers me because of that situation. But what bothers me more than anything else is that I could be so foolish to believe that I could produce change in any situation, that I could turn around any circumstance. How dumb, how deceptive that is. But as a leader, if you're not careful, you'll fall into that trap. So back to David. Eventually what happened was David became king. Saul reached a point where he was crazy. He even consorted a witch, which was against the law of God, in order to find out what was going to happen in a battle that he was about to engage in. And what happened was Samuel came supernaturally, spoke to Saul and prophesied over Saul and said, "You're going to die the next day." Now, Samuel had died previous to this. The witch may have thought that through her powers of creating a seance that she called Samuel up, but that's not what happened. God enabled Samuel to show up and to give that word to Saul. And Saul died the next day along with his sons. So David became king. Okay, now we're going to talk about a leader who's secure. David, when Saul died, even though all of Israel knew that David had been anointed some years before by Samuel to be king. Okay, so everybody knew it. Everybody knew that Saul's leadership was declining even toward the end of Saul's life, and they knew that David was the righteous and proper king. But what happened was this: David did not lift a finger to make himself king. He waited. And the men of Judah, the tribe that he came from, came to him and said, "We all know that God anointed you to be king. Would you come and be king?" So for 7 years, David was king over Judah, not all the other tribes of Israel. And David did not go to war against the other tribes to make himself king. He did not exert authority or influence to become king. Instead, he waited. And after that 7 year period, the rest of the tribes came to him and said, "We want you to be king." See, leaders who have humility, they realize that their leadership ability and authority is dependent upon the consent of other people. You know, in some of our founding documents, it talks about the consent of the governed. That's a phrase that every leader should memorize. You operate in leadership at the consent of the governed. In other words, you're not a leader unless people will willingly follow you. So there was years later, there was an occasion where David's own son Absalom rose up and in a coup against David. So David had to flee the city of Jerusalem overnight because he knew that Absalom was coming to kill him. And I'll talk about Absalom in a minute. And David fled. And when he fled, the priests came out to David and they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, which embodied, and more than embodied, was the manifest presence of God in the midst of Israel. And because the people almost looked at it as a magical object, those that didn't know what it really was, that, man, if the ark is with us, we can't be defeated. And the truth is, if God's not with you, you can't be defeated. And David turns to the priest and he says, "Look, take the ark back in. Because if God is not in this, and if God's not defending me, then guess what? The ark's not going to help me." And David refused to come against his son Absalom at first because he said, "If God is pleased with me, I'll continue in my leadership. If he's not, then he can remove me as leader." That's humility, and that's a recognition of where your authority comes from. And of course, Absalom dies in battle, and David is restored as king. But when David's brought back, some of the people don't immediately recognize him or reauthorize him as their king, and yet he doesn't go to war against them. He doesn't exert power to bring them under his authority. He waits, and the situation works itself out. So that's David. There are instances where you and I would have acted, and David sought God first and asked the Lord, am I going to succeed in this? Should I do this? That's humility. Humility is not weakness. One definition of humility is strength under control. And humility and inferiority are not even close to each other. If you feel inferior, that's a perversion of who God made you. God made you to have in Him, to have confidence in Him, to have a security, to know what He's made you to do, to know what talents He's given you, to know the limits of those talents, and to be able to accomplish great things for Him. Not for you, but for Him. And so David is a phenomenal leader. By the way, there's a book out there that I would recommend if you want to follow up on the story of these three kings. And the title is The Tale of Three Kings, written by Gene Edwards. And it's a phenomenal book about leadership, talking about David and talking about Saul and talking about Absalom. So I want to finish talking about Absalom. Okay, so Absalom was incredibly handsome, and people were naturally attracted to him. He had a natural charisma. He had beautiful hair. For some reason in the narrative, it mentions that he had phenomenal hair. This whole story is found in 2 Samuel in the Old Testament. And but he nursed an offense against his father because one of his half-brothers had raped Absalom's sister, and David did not do anything about it. So over a period of multiple years, Absalom carried a grudge. By the way, he killed the brother that raped his sister. But he just festered in this grudge toward his father David. And what he decided to do, and there are leaders, illegitimate leaders that will do this, is he decided he was going to manipulate the people of Israel through flattery and win them over to his side. So whenever anybody came to Jerusalem because they needed to talk to the king, because they needed the king's wisdom, King David's wisdom to solve a dispute, Absalom would meet them at the gate and hear what their problem was, and he would say things like, "Man, if I was king, I think that I could solve that issue for you." And it says that he did that day after day, and he did that over a prolonged period of time. And in the scriptures it says, and so he won the people over to himself. See, there are leaders who use intimidation in order to bring people under their control. And there are leaders who use manipulation to bring leaders under their control. One form of manipulation is flattery. You know, all of us can be subject to flattery. And flattery tells you what you want. If you're insecure in particular, flattery makes you sound like the greatest thing since sliced bread. Like you're the greatest person ever God ever created. Oh my goodness, you speak like an angel. You sing. Your talent is limitless. Someone ever talks to you and feeds you flattery. The difference between encouragement is encouragement puts something in you, but flattery is meant to take something out of you. You know, when I was younger, man, I ate up flattery because I was insecure. If you told me that I was a phenomenal leader, a good principal, really good teacher, oh, you're just such a kind person, all of that, it was like more, 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 more. But over the years, I've come to realize, no, flattery is meant to get something out of you. And so I'm not completely impervious to it, but flattery has a harder time to get through to me because now I question the motives of people who flatter. And I know that many times they're flattering in order to get something, in order to manipulate something from me. So Absalom was a flatterer, and one day King David finds out that Absalom is in another part of the country. A large number of people have gathered around him, and that they've come together to make Absalom king. And when David hears that news, he flees the city immediately with the people that are loyal to him, because he now realizes that that offense that Absalom had toward him has reached its apex, and that Absalom is not going to come to him and say, "Father, please give me your crown." he is going to kill him in order to become king. So Absalom is a flatterer. Absalom will take authority where David wouldn't snatch authority from Saul. Absalom will. Absalom is completely full of himself. Um, Absalom has no limits as to what he will do. He will manipulate, he will control, he loves authority, he loves to be the head. It's funny, Absalom's sort of like Saul. It's like a sandwich. You have Saul with his insecurities and with his misuse of authority, and you have Absalom who has some of the same characteristics. So why am I sharing this? I'm sharing this because you and I need to realize and to come to grips with where our insecurities are. And we need to deal with where our insecurities are. Because otherwise they will become a trap and they will sabotage any leadership that God has placed us in, no matter what level of leadership it is. We need to also be free from flattery. See, you need to know who you are. You need to know who you are, who you aren't. You need to know the limits of your leadership. You need to know the limits of your talents. The Apostle Paul wrote, and he said that we have to have a right judgment of ourselves. In other words, we have to have a right self-image. I'm not dung under people's feet, but I'm not the greatest thing to come down the pike either. And so you have to have a right self-image of yourself. Along with that, you've got to have an idea of what your level of ambition is. There are people who have limitless levels of ambition. And that drives them. That drives them to violate their conscience. It causes them to step over other people. Other people are just stepping stones. Other people are just obstacles along the way to getting to what their ambition drives them to. If you're going to be a good leader, you can't allow that to happen. You've got to have a handle on what your ambitions are. I've taken jobs out of ambition and now, in retrospect, realize this is the wrong motive. I didn't take that job because I wanted to better the lives of people, because I wanted to lift them up, and because I wanted them to be, the trophy of the effectiveness of my leadership. I did it for me. And if you are that kind of leader, what will happen is that'll come back to haunt you. It'll bite you in the butt. And it should. And by the way, if you're a Christian, God will put his thumb on the scales and make sure that it bites you in the butt. God didn't create people to be under your control. He didn't create people to be manipulated by you. And he didn't create people for you to be Lord over them. There's only one Lord. And all the rest of us are servants, and all the rest of us are at the same level. I'll talk more about this. In the next one, I think I'll talk about how characteristics can be taken to extreme, so that if a characteristic, think of it as a coin with two sides, so that if you overplay a strength, it becomes a weakness. But that's for the next one. Subscribe to this channel if you find it helpful. Along with that, leave comments because sometimes I'm spitballing from my experiences, and I hope that it's helpful to you. I hope that whatever level of leadership you're at, that you can learn from my experiences. My experiences, some of them cost me dearly. And you would be a fool to have to relearn the lessons that other people have paid for. In other words, if you've been to college, what I'm trying to do is I'm helping you to audit the class of leadership instead of paying graduate level tuition to get the elementary lessons. And that's all these are. These are not necessarily the most profound things you're ever going to hear, but for some of you, it's exactly what you need to hear right now. Keep in mind there are other lessons in this series. So far, this is the fourth one, and there'll probably be another one or two. Appreciate your watching this. Appreciate your listening to this old dude just go on and on and on, but hopefully that it's something that you can use in your life. God bless you, and be the best leader you can be.